Our story continues. Chapter 4. There was no flaw to the prophet, not that any could see. He looked so young to his followers, yet his words were wiser than those of any ancient sage. His voice was pure music. He had not the trace of stubble on his young countenance, one barely seeming out of childhood. Those who had the privilege of seeing him close always came away with the impression of handsome, almost beautiful features, yet their descriptions would have varied based on their own preferences. All would have agreed, though, that his hair, which fell well past his shoulders, was the gold of the sun, and that his eyes were a luminescent mix of blue and silver. He was slim and athletic, in the manner of an acrobat or dancer. When the prophet moved, it was with such grace as even a sleek cat could not match. He was clad in the silver-white robes of the Cathedral of Light, his feet sandaled. At the moment, the prophet stood in his glory, having just completed a sermon to more than 3,000 eager pilgrims. Behind him, a choir of some 200, all of them as perfect in the face and form as humans could be, sang the closing praises. The audience remained enraptured as always. Although the sect had other locations elsewhere, the prime cathedral just north of the capital had a constant flow of newcomers mixing with the local worshippers. After all, here was where the prophet himself lived. Here was where one could hear his personal words.
I must change that,
he thought as he accepted the homage of his followers.
All should know my words personally, perhaps through a sphere held high by the priests of each location during sermons.
He locked away the notion for another time, his own interest on a matter far removed from his present circumstances. The mortal, Odyssean Ul Diomed, and his ragtag followers were on the move again. Long golden horns blared as he finally turned from the dais. The choir shifted their singing to mark his departure, never once missing a single note. The members were from all castes, all races, but in their joyous harmony, one would have had great trouble telling any of them apart. He was met by two of his senior priests, Gamuel and Oris. Oris had her hair bound back, and although she looked old enough to be his grandmother, her expression could not hide her attraction and love for him. The prophet could see still how the oval face had once rivaled any of the young ones in the choir. But as with the singers, he had had little interest in the female priest then or now. He was also certainly not inclined toward any male aspect, such as broad-jawed Gamuel's. No, only one being, one female, had ever stirred his passions so, and she was now anathema to him.
A rich, magnificent speech as usual,
Oris cooed. Despite her demeanor around him, she was one of the most able of his servants. Besides, the prophet could hardly blame her for her admiration. She was only human, whereas he was so much more.
It sounds so terribly redundant to agree with her on this subject, but I fear I must again, Great One,
added Gamuel, bowing low. He had once been a great warrior, and stood half again as wide as his master, but no one doubted which of the two was the more powerful. The prophet had chosen Gamuel for his role because, in the remotest manner possible, he had been the one mortal most reminding the prophet of his true self.
It was good,
their master conceded. By the priest's standards, all of his speeches were perfection, but even he had to admit that there was a bit more to this one than many previous. Possibly that had something to do with the current flux. The status quo of which he had become used to suddenly no longer existed. In truth, that both infuriated and enticed him.
One sensed the mood shift when you spoke of the triune,
Oris went on, her mouth wrinkling as she pronounced the last word.
There are new rumors of trouble concerning them, and some fanatic from the Asinian regions.
Yes, his name is Uldisian Uldiamid. He has caused the temple much trouble in Toraja. We should hear official word of that very soon.
Neither priest registered much surprise at this knowledge. They had both been around long enough to understand that the prophet was privy to things that they could never even imagine. Still, he always had them report whatever they heard, just as a matter of form. There was always the remote chance that something might escape his notice. Gamwell shook his head.
So near. Will this Odyssean seek to war against the cathedral too?
You may assume that, my son.
Then we should move against him.
The prophet gave the priest the sort of look that a father gives a naive but favored son.
No, good Gamwell. We must move with him.
Holy One?
But the prophet said no more. He strode away from his top acolytes toward his private quarters. No one followed in his wake. The glorious master of the Cathedral of Light, insisting no servants ever attend him unless summoned. No one questioned this quirk. They were all too enthralled by his holy presence. For ceremony, and the sake of his acolytes' concerns, helmed guards kept watch at the elegantly carved twin doors. The 6 stood as statues as he neared.
Be at peace,
he told them.
You are dismissed for the evening.
The senior guard immediately went down on one knee.
Holy One, we shouldn't be leaving our posts. Your life.
Is there anyone here who could possibly threaten it? Is there anyone I should fear?
They could not argue with him there, for all knew that the prophet wielded powers unbelievable. He could defend himself far better than they could. Even the guards understood that they were for show, yet their devotion always made them hesitate to leave.
Go with my blessings,
the ivory youth declared, adding a beatific smile to encourage them to depart.
Go, knowing that you are all in my heart.
They flushed with pride, even as they grudgingly obeyed. The prophet did not watch them leave. He walked directly to the doors, which flung open by themselves to admit him, and then swung tightly shut once he had passed through. There was little in the way of furniture in the otherwise sumptuous chamber the robed figure entered. A plush down couch was where his followers assumed the prophet slept. Those who assumed that he slept at all. Beyond that stood several crested marble stands, atop which perched an enviable collection of the finest vases and glass sculptures from throughout the world of sanctuary. Fresh garlands of flowers draped the walls, and vast tapered rugs with the most intricate, handcrafted patterns covered much of the shining marble floor. The walls also bore magnificent paintings of the natural beauty of every imaginable land, each personally dictated to the various artists by the golden-haired figure. But above lay what most of those with the rare privilege of entering the prophet's private sanctum thought the true focus. An immense mural covered the ceiling from end to end, each portion of it filled with fantastical images, creatures thought only myth, landscapes almost surreal, and most of all, a host of exquisitely rendered, ethereal beings flying about through the use of vast, feathered wings spouting from near their shoulders. The figures were male and female, and all clad in gossamer robes. Each had features that would have been the envy of the most beauteous princess or dashing prince. To the careful onlooker, it was evident that they were not merely part of the scenery, but rather they were the ones molding it. They were angels, as humans portrayed them at least. The prophet, more the wiser, acknowledged the artisan's exceptional attempt. But an attempt was all it truly was. A mere mortal could not have grasped the true essence of such beings. A mere mortal could not conceive of creatures who were not exactly physical in nature, but instead harmonic resonances. Yes, a mere mortal could not conceive of angels as they truly were, but the prophet could. After all, was he himself not among the greatest of angels? It happened in a flash of brilliant light, 1,000 times quicker than a blink. The chamber shook, and it was as if a violent wind current erupted from the very spot upon which the gold-tressed figure stood. Gone in an instant was the prophet, who for all his perfection was a mere shadow of the awesome truth. In his place stood a looming, hooded figure with vast wings of flame. Within the hood there was no face, instead a radiance, formed from the blending of both light and sound, so wondrous that it would have been almost blinding to most humans. What appeared to be long, silver hair draping around it was also no more than pure light and sound mixing together. He was clad in breastplate and robes, the former a shimmering copper, the latter as if sewn from the very rays of the sun. In mortal terms, what had been the prophet seemed now some divine warrior, and in truth, he had faced many a harsh battle against the demons of the burning hells. So many, in fact, that the angel Inarius had finally spurned the eternal war between the high heavens and their monstrous foes, and set about finding a place for himself far from the struggle. With him, he had taken others of like mind, all weary of winning this victory and losing the next, over and over and over.
I searched for peace, and was granted its illusion.
Inarius thought bitterly.
I found my sanctuary, and named it thus.
But his mistake had been long before founding sanctuary. To ever accept the entreaties of a pack of demons, also no longer caring which side won. He had compounded that error by falling for the seductions of their leader, whose every word had mirrored his own resolution. It was because of the commingling between the two, and among their followers as well, that sanctuary had become not only a refuge, but a necessity. Because of her, all this had become.
Would that I had never met you, Lilith. Would that I had never seen or touched you.
But he had, and all his regrets were simply that, regrets. Even he could not go back and alter the past. The flight from the high heavens and burning hells, the search for a place for the renegades to live, the creation of sanctuary. They were all an indelible part of history, as was Lilith's betrayal. Inarius gestured, and a fiery line split the ceiling down the middle. The chamber shook as a gap opened in the center of the mural. Without hesitation, the angel soared up into the air and out through the gap. He had no fear of being noted. The mortals were naturally blind to his presence, and his power shielded him from any others who might have been otherwise able to detect the celestial being. Inarius no longer even had to worry about the high heavens sensing either him or sanctuary, for he felt at last that his powers were vast enough to keep even the Angiris Council oblivious, especially with the everlasting war to further distract their attention. And so, for the first time in centuries, Inarius soared high into the sky. He let his wings spread wide as he soaked in the sensation of being utterly free. It had been foolish of him to wait so long to finally fly again. Certainly, it had not been due to fear, no. Inarius realized that Lilith's betrayal of him, even more so than the heinous slaughter of the other angels and demons, had struck him to the very core. Only for that reason had he kept himself confined to such mortal cloaks as the prophet and others.
No more. No more. After this farce is at an end, all here shall know of my glory, as is right.
After all, if not for him, none of this would have existed. It was his right, his duty, to keep sanctuary on the course he had planned, Lilith would be punished, the demons would be ousted, and the troublesome mortal would become nothing but a fading memory. Sanctuary would be as he envisioned it, or he would destroy it and begin anew. The angel arced suddenly, soaring past the gargantuan cathedral and within seconds over the capital. Kejan, the city was vast enough to be a land unto itself, and there were some who argued that the surrounding regions had been named for it, not the other way around. Such trivial matters were of no interest to Inarius, but he did find the lights from the capital interesting in a crude fashion. They vaguely reminded him of the brilliance of the high heavens, a place of eternal illumination.
I will make over Sanctuary once this incident is at an end,
he swore.
I will make my own high heavens, one that would be envied by the first.
But it would require much sacrifice, especially by his mortals. But it would be done. He had too long suffered silently in squalor when by rights he could have lived as more befitting his role. He would create a paradise untroubled by petty feuds. Without warning, a sensation of familiarity struck him so hard that, for a moment, the angel veered off course. Inarius corrected his flight instantly, then immediately turned about. He had thought it her at first, but her presence was already known to him. No, this was another. Inarius felt what to a human would have resembled a fast pounding of his heart. First Lilith, and now one once nearly as close to the angel as she had been. Above the cathedral again, the glorious figure paused to survey the dark lands surrounding him. Yet, a thorough survey of every direction revealed nothing. The brief glimmer was the only hint of this new return.
But then, he is clever, even if ever misguided. After all, he may be of her creation, but so too is he of mine.
The resurrection of yet another old and apparently living memory would change nothing. However, as Inarius descended into the chamber and the ceiling began realigning itself, he already knew that, when the time came, he would treat the other just as he intended his former lover, even if it was his errant son. Uldyssian rose from the simple blanket upon which he slept to a sea of new faces staring apprehensively in his direction.
I couldn't get them to stay any farther away,
Cerinthia apologized as she came on his right. Her dark hair was bound back as she walked more like a soldier than a merchant's daughter. Despite her growing proficiency with her powers, she continued to carry her spear in an aggressive grip.
It's all right, Sari,
he replied automatically, only afterward realizing that he had slipped back to her childhood name. Her expression tightened, and moistness appeared around her otherwise stern eyes. Only 3 people had consistently called her by that name once she had grown up. 2 of those were dead, the last, Achilleos. Rather than try to correct his error and likely compound the situation, Uldyssian focused on the newcomers. They were of all castes and ages, and, as he knew would be the case, there were many children with them. The last greatly concerned Uldyssian, just as it had when the Parthens had brought along their own offspring. Children had already died, and those deaths, more than any, tore at his heart. Yet, no matter his entreaties against such, families still joined him.
I should be better able to protect them,
he thought bitterly.
If not for the children, then who most am I doing this for?
He never delved deeper into that question, for the answer ever revolved around him. He did this for those who followed his path, true, but also because of outright vengeance. There was no denying that at all, no matter how base such a reason was. and that made seeing the new children only worse. Straightening, Odyssean accepted a water sack from Cerinthia. He drank some of the cool liquid, then poured more of the contents over his head in order to wake himself up. Odyssean did not care what the newcomers thought of his actions. If such a little thing turned them from him, then they were not ready. But no one left. They all stood patiently waiting. He hid a frown, having secretly hoped that some of the parents would take their young and ease his guilt a little.
You all come to me for the same reason, I hope.
Odyssean declared.
You know what the gift means.
Several heads bobbed up and down. Odyssean estimated more than 100 newcomers. They filled most of the clearing where he slept. His own followers had blended back into the jungles, watching both hopefully and warily. Each convert was to the others a new miracle. He saw no reason to waste more time with speeches. He had promised the Counselor Senior that he would take his followers away from Taraja, and Odyssean had always been a man of his word. The son of Diomedes stretched forth a hand to the nearest, an older woman whose head was protected by a multicolored scarf. Odyssean sensed her wonder and fear warring with one another, and realized that she had come here alone.
Please,
he murmured, recalling his own long-dead mother.
Please come to me.
She did not hesitate, which was a credit to her more than him. The woman was thin and had a pinched face, but her eyes were a beautiful brown, and he suspected that in her youth she had been quite alluring. No one questioned what an elderly person was doing among the rest. Age did not seem to matter much when it came to the gifts, save that those below 10 years seemed to take longer to develop any sign of success. Possibly this was some natural factor to keep them from harming themselves or others, as could sometimes be noted with some animals.
What's your name?
He asked.
Maharete.
Her voice was strong. She did not want others to consider her a foolish old crone unworthy of this moment. Nodding his approval, the former farmer took her left hand in his.
Mahariti, open your thoughts to me, your heart to me. Close your eyes, though, if you wish.
She left them open, as he had expected. Again, Mahariti rose in his estimation. A peculiar buzzing filled the air. Odyssean had but a single breath to react. He glared at the empty air. A moment later, 3 spinning objects converged on his location and crashed against an invisible barrier as if against walls of iron. The deadly objects tumbled to the ground, where they were revealed as arced pieces of metal with small, glittering teeth all along the edges. Had they struck Odyssean, he had no doubt that he would have been dead in an instant, and possibly with his head lying unattached to his body. From among the waiting figures burst 2 unkempt, insignificant-looking men. Yet, as they charged Odyssean, their forms shifted and they became peace warders. From nowhere, one produced a short lance that he threw at the son of Diomedes. The sharp tip had an odd red tinge to it. At the same time, the second cast another of the savage metal weapons. But before Odyssean could act, the whirling weapon abruptly turned and headed back to its wielder. It caught him in the chest, cutting through the metal breastplate, then the cloth, flesh, and bone underneath. The peace warder went flying back among the Taragians, who just managed to avoid his bloody body before it crashed in a ghastly pile. Odyssean concentrated on the lance, but although it slowed, it did not stop. The red tip could only be demonic in origin. Cerinthia leapt forward, using her spear to knock it off course. It went spinning past him. Before the other peace warder could do anything else, some of the new Taragians seized him. He let out an oath, which turned into a cry of pain as the crowd began to tear him apart. This was not what Odyssean had in mind. This was not battle, but butchery.
Stop!
As he spoke, he used his abilities to gently move aside those holding the peace warder until only the villain himself remained. The Peace Warder tried in vain to regain his limbs. He stood at an angle that should have made him fall on his back, only Uldyssian keeping that from happening. The warrior's every muscle strained as Uldyssian loomed over him. One hand twitched, and the son of Diomedes noted that a dagger hung near the fingers.
I can let you take that dagger, if you like,
he said without emotion.
but it'll do you no good.
Yet, still the man struggled for the feeble weapon. With a sigh, Uldyssian straightened the Peace Warder, then let the one arm move. The hand immediately grasped the blade. The Peace Warder raised the dagger up, and to Uldyssian's startlement, slashed his own throat. A hush fell over the throng, but as Uldyssian, stupefied by the suicide, let the bleeding man drop, he saw that they assumed that their leader had caused the warrior to slay himself. They thought that the fatal strike had been Uldyssian's punishment and proof of his power over such assassins. Still managing to hide his shock, Uldyssian stared at the Peace Warder. The man gurgled twice, his body twitching, then stilled.
All the while, he only wanted to kill himself. He'd failed and knew no other course.
Such fanaticism astounded Uldyssian. Perhaps the man had believed that he would suffer some more terrible fate, but somehow that seemed doubtful. In fact, Uldyssian had been toying with the notion as to how to let the assassin live. Enough had perished last night, and now with the coming of the new day, more bloodshed had happened. He was sick of it all.
But you chose this course,
he reminded himself.
Master Uldyssian! Master Uldyssian!
Uldyssian gratefully looked to Romus, any interruption welcome. The former criminal pointed behind himself, where two other Parthens were dragging a limp form toward the rest. A third Peace Warder. Only now did Uldyssian think of the fact that the first attack had come from farther back.
We found him, just within the jungle,
explained Romus, rubbing his bald pate. As the other Parthens dropped the body, the cause of death became very evident. Someone had expertly cut down the assassin with an arrow to the base of the neck, apparently relying on honed talents rather than still questionable powers. It was yet another death, but one that could not have been avoided. The Peace Warder had brought it on himself.
Good work, Romus.
Wasn't my doing, Master Uldyssian.
The other two also shook their heads. Uldyssian digested this for a moment.
Then who?
But no one took credit. Frowning, Uldyssian knelt by the body. The shot had been an excellent one. As he had earlier noted, the work of an obviously skilled archer. A slight shift in direction, and either the shot would have missed, or the armor would have deflected it. There was a dark substance on the shaft. Uldyssian rubbed some of it off, his brow furrowed in perplexity. It was moist dirt. Moist dirt covering most of the arrow, as if someone had once buried the bolt.